This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you been thinking about therapy? Have you been trying to get in to see a therapist? Have you found that a lot of therapists that you've been recommended to have either closed books or they've got a really long waiting list? Sometimes months. If you're lucky, it's a couple of weeks. Now, what if there was an alternative that gave you quicker access and at your convenience? So when starting to think about looking for a therapist, try BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule needs. So just fill out the brief questionnaire and get matched with a registered therapist. You can also switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get moving with therapy and visit BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/Gunter today will give you 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gunter, GUNTER.
Listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. So let's continue with the particularly important and topical issue of violence against women. And as I said on a number of different platforms, if we simply focus on killing, we're missing the point. We need to understand more deeply the changes that we need to make in our thinking and unravel the biases that keep us locked into both individual and social conditions that allow for violence to continue fundamentally. So today I want to delve deeper into the underlying causes of this violence, because I think, unlike what some people are saying, is that it's predictable. I want to examine how patriarchal values, especially those of territoriality, hierarchy, acquisition, and competition, foster a culture of entitlement, dominance, and control. I also want to explore cognitive biases, especially within law enforcement, that continue to perpetuate the cycle and reflect on the broader social implications. So let's get going. Let's begin our journey into the darker corners of our society and our social norms so that we actually can find a path towards light and change. So for those of you familiar with my podcast, I'm fundamentally about making good men great, but I also need to address the reality is some of us aren't even playing in the right playground. Some of us are, in fact, still stuck in not just a medieval frame of mind, but a social frame of mind that doesn't match well with the ideas of democracy and equity, distribution and cooperation. And we can see this in all sorts of spheres of our lives. Most importantly, we can see that in many families, we can see it in many cultures, we can see it in institutions. Now, let me talk about the four key elements: territoriality, hierarchy, acquisition, and competition, because these are the ones that, in my experience, shape the structure. Now, some of you might go, well, how the hell did he come to all of this? Well, firstly, I've got over 40 years' experience as a psychotherapist and as a psychologist. I'm deeply steeped in a perpetual state of curiosity. So for me, researching things, especially those issues that apply directly and indirectly to my work, is just part of the course. And when I decided to focus my attention more fully on boys and men to understand why it is that we have such poor mental health statistics, that we die earlier than women, that we are so prone to suicide. The inevitable conclusion that I drew was that this is the result of how we as men are conditioned, how we're socialized, and in many respects, how we're brainwashed. We operate on a whole bunch of stuff that's just myth and just like untruths. It's interesting because in many respects, the scientific progress that we've made in the neurosciences, in sociology, anthropology, in psychology, doesn't seem to get much of a look in when it comes to creating social policies and resourcing areas in our community that will allow people to flourish more. So let's talk about territoriality, which isn't just about physical spaces. It has some elements to physical spaces, but in the patriarchal condition, it's about claiming authority over ideas, bodies, and decisions. When I talk about hierarchy, it means that we're establishing levels of dominance, often placing women in a subordinate role. Acquisition closely relates to hierarchy because the key issues in hierarchy are about status and prestige. And so, acquisition is not just about material wealth, it's also about acquiring status, acquiring prestige. And this fundamentally rests on the idea of being competitive. That is, I need to beat somebody else. Now, for some men, if they can't beat men, they'll beat women. And sometimes that is absolutely literal. Now, there is a lot of guys out there who, when, trapped in a certain situation where they feel a loss of control, they'll attack men as well. So we need to consider this. But, the topic here is about no more dead women. So what is it that we actually fundamentally need to look at? So together, these elements create an environment that's absolutely ripe for entitlement and control, where aggression can become a normalized tool for maintaining dominance. Now, this isn't confined simply to men who are mentally ill or who've got deep-rooted mental health issues. There are lots of people in our society, lots of men in our society, which on the day-to-day way of living appear to be perfectly logical, reasonable, rational human beings. But in their intimate relationships behind closed doors, they can become violent monsters. Now, I use that term deliberately because to instill a persistent level of fear in someone that you profess to love is, in my book, monstrous. In some ways, we could talk about it being evil. It's Machiavellian in a way. So we can talk about the dark triad. Yes, I am talking about narcissism. And one of the things that patriarchal values does is that allows men to begin to slide into acquiring a greater degree of narcissism. So how do we get from dominance to aggression? Right? So, if we're talking about this sense of entitlement and need for control, which is ingrained in patriarchal norms, how does it get to aggression and violence? Well, the interesting thing is, in many respects, highly patriarchal men who are predominantly seriously narcissistic don't actually deal with stress well. There is an underlying fear, persistent fear of the loss of control, the feeling of vulnerability in a way that's not healthy, right? We should be able to be, emotionally vulnerable. But for, men like that, it is an antithesis. You always have to show dominance. I had a conversation with someone recently about, how to really communicate with a woman that you're starting to date. And my comment was be open, be transparent, be honest, share with her what you're feeling. And his reaction was, well, that's not really manly, is it? And I went, well, what's the alternative? That's not exactly manly either. In fact, that's far from it. The capacity to allow yourself to be emotionally vulnerable, to be transparent, that takes courage. The other thing is just, an aggressive, dominant, controlling position. So, in that context, men become subject to being prone to escalating into physical violence. And it's a pattern that's repeated in so many different areas of society, in institutions, in within families in particular, within friendships or social groups, within sport. I mean, sport's particularly prone to this whole process. And it's condoned in sport. That's a scary bit for me. So one of the things that I want to point out is, why isn't that? Do we need more laws? Do we need what? What do we need? And the point that I want to make here is that the law enforcement institutions, like the police and the courts and so on, are not immune to the cognitive biases that patriarchal structures bring with it. For many, many, many years, women were often, in a sense, discounted when they come for help. She's just overreacting. It's typical woman. She's going over the top, and so they would send her home back into a dangerous, environment. Within the courts, men were given chances repeatedly and released back into the community, despite the fact that there was very clear evidence that they were domestic violence perpetrators. It wasn't a question of, innocent till proven guilty. This person had demonstrated by their behaviour that they were guilty. They just haven't been through the system that has found them guilty. And sometimes, a lot of times, when they have gone through the system and they have been found guilty, the punishment is completely disproportionate to the offences that they've committed. So they're back out on the street very, very quickly and back into threatening not just their ex-partner or their continuing partner, but other women as well. So institutional biases are complicit in protecting the aggressors rather than protecting the victim. So this is where we fail the victims and where we enable the cycle of violence to continue almost unchecked. Because what we're doing in the system, ironically, is we're protecting the needs of the one as opposed to the needs of the many. I listened to an ex-policeman talking about holding a 10-year-old girl in his arms who was dying from stab wounds that were inflicted by her father. That is a situation that no one should be exposed to and that no girl, no woman should ever have to experience. To have her life cut short in such a violent way. We have enough problems with illness and all sorts of other accidents that, terminate our life. Why allow a situation to continue wherein a single human being can take out many, many other lives? Let's think about the Bondi situation. Again, the system, was unable or incapable of actually dealing with someone who potentially was a threat. Now, in that case, there's some wriggle room about that. There can be some benefits of the doubt. But with many other cases, it is very clear that this person, once they get out back on the street, they're just going to continue to do what they've been doing. So, I'm a Trekkie. So, in the teachings of Star Trek, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one. And it might seem noble in theory, right? But it's an essential ethic that we sometimes really need to hold true. Not in all situations. There needs to be flexibility as well. But if our social structures and institutions continue to ignore and invalidate the pain and needs of women in the case of violence, and I'm talking about emotional violence as well, then these structures are failing. And so let me give you an example. I mean, one of the things that I progressively hear more and more and more are teenage boys who are fundamentally, first of all, bullies towards their mothers, and secondly, are highly threatening. Now, my immediate question is, how can that be? And most of all, a lot of the times it's, where's dad? Now, in some situations, there is no father. But in that instance, also, that boy, especially, as an adolescent, needs to be taught and managed that threats, intimidation, aggression, and violence are connected, and they can't be excused, and therefore there needs to be repercussions. There needs to be consequences around that. Letting the person off. And we know from research in domestic violence that if a man has to encounter the legal system the first time he transgresses the sort of civil rights of their partner, transgresses into her territory emotionally violently or physically violently, then they tend to not do it again. But if they get away with it a few times, they're going to keep doing it because they've gotten away with it. They'll find a way to, manipulate in part the system, and they'll manipulate people around them. Things like, oh, I can't believe that he would do such a thing. She must be, partly to blame, or she must be doing something, or maybe she's even lying. Now, that process does take some investigation. It does take some careful, critical thinking about what's going on, because those things do happen. We just need to go back to Amber Heard and the situation that she portrayed Johnny Depp to be a perpetrator in. So again, I want to urge everybody to reflect, firstly, on the patriarchal values, how they manifest in your life, because they still do. How they influence your views and actions. Think about how you can challenge these norms within your community. Now, your community starts with your relationship and your family. Think about the behavior of your sons in that context. What are they exposed to? How are they reacting? Are they, loving? Are they respectful? Do they cooperate? Are they, disrespectful, aggressive, threatening? Are they bullies? Right? You need to take action at that point. So, it's only when we acknowledge and address these deep-seated issues that we're going to, be able to dismantle that cycle of entitlement, dominance, and violence that some men, and quite a few men, bring into relationships. And they're not confined to intimate relationships. Some of those are subtly expressed within areas like leadership, management, corporate governance. So, deep food for thought. But most importantly, instead of having another royal commission or more studies into why men do this, we know basically what the story is. We know how this happens. What we need is resources to protect women. We need to have education of those frontline workers to act without a patriarchal bias. And we need to do it now, not tomorrow or in a year's time. And those politicians who turn this issue into a political football, shame on you. Get another job. And on that note, let me thank you for joining me today. Let's continue to work towards a society where equity and respect are fundamental and paramount. So until next time, stay aware, stay inspired, and keep pushing for positive change. So until next time, this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.